Welcome to Church History Over-Simplified, Session 5 of A Foundation in Orthodox Christianity. So we're beginning with the history of the Church, with Pentecost, the granting of the gift of the Holy Spirit to the apostles in Jerusalem. With that opening of the apostolic mission, they go out from Jerusalem to all the surrounding regions, to the ends of the earth. What they preach is the gospel, the words that they received from Jesus himself, what he had taught them. They now were themselves preaching, interpreting the scriptures, which to them would mean what we would now call the Old Testament. The New Testament is the recording of that apostolic preaching over the course of the first century, that in due time becomes known as the New Testament and is part of the scriptures as we know them now. They are establishing churches across the Mediterranean and beyond, to begin with mostly in cities. In the second and third centuries, we have this developing pattern of persecutions. At first, the authorities they don't really care. They're completely ignorant about Christianity. It's not seen as anything other than something odd going on among the Jews. Eventually, it does attract truly hostile attention. We can see early signs in the second century of them being called atheists because Christians don't honor and follow the Roman religion, the basic go along, get along approach of worshiping all the gods, part of a civic religion that upheld the civic order of the Roman Empire. Christians weren't cooperating, and over time this came to be seen as a real threat to the emperors, and they start engaging in mass campaigns of persecution, and when Christians refuse to bow to these demands, they are increasingly punished and many of them martyred. And this witness of the martyrs becomes characteristic of this whole period. Those who actually are martyred are revered, their memory is kept precious, and it's understood that the blood of the martyrs fertilizes the church. It's what allows, in fact, the church to grow stronger and stronger the more it's persecuted. There's also confessors, those who are not killed, but suffer terribly for the sake of the faith, and they become the generations of leadership in the church, the moral center, those whose faith is confirmed through their sufferings. Within that group, we have the apostolic fathers, those who were disciples of the apostles and then become themselves leaders, people like Polycarp of Smyrna, for example, St. Ignatius of Antioch, and others, who continued the apostolic witness and developed it themselves. St. Irenaeus of Lyon is an especially influential figure in the second century, towards the end of this period of the second century, writing against the heresies, among other works, which records the rise of many false teachings, heresies, within Christianity or around Christianity. Gnosticism is something that he characterizes in depth. During this time, the church is first called Catholic, a word that now gets kind of confused, but its original meaning is actually quite useful. It is to be full, perfect, whole, what is taught consistently everywhere, as opposed to some narrow sect or secret teaching. This is something that is accessible to all. In the third century, we have schools of theology that are able to develop even in the face of persecution. The Alexandrian school is the most influential. That's Alexandria in Egypt, a tremendous center of learning, which clarifies the Orthodox interpretation of Scripture. Orthodox here being set specifically in contrast to what is heresy. So you have this being the authentic interpretation of Scripture, the true apostolic tradition being set forth. Then we come to the 4th century, and at the beginning of it, Emperor Constantine establishes the Peace of Constantine, which ends persecution in 313. By the end of the century, Christianity is established as the official religion by Emperor Theodosius, which then introduces a harmony, synergia, between the church and the emperor. So this is a harmony, a certain degree of collaboration in different spheres. This is not what has been called Caesaropapism, this idea that the Caesar, the emperor, is acting as a pope over the church, like as if this is a modern, poor historical interpretation that's been imposed on the church of this era, imagining that the emperors were directly controlling and setting forth doctrine and practice. That's not actually the case. Certainly there were times when they imposed pressure, but the church was quite capable of pushing back, and in fact, in many cases, did. So, also during the 4th century, this is the time of the Cappadocian Fathers. So Cappadocia is a region in modern-day Turkey, and we have St. Basil the Great, his brother, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Gregory the Theologian, as just these tremendously gifted theologians who presented the clear teaching of the truth of the Incarnation, that Jesus is the God-man, both God and man, fully. In the year 379, their teaching is integrated into the final form of the Creed, the symbol of faith, in the Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople. We see the liturgy, the rite of baptism and chrismation, fully developed essentially as we see them now. You would be able to recognize what is being done if we were to go back to that century. We can find clear evidence of this from the witness of catechetical sermons of St. Cyril of Jerusalem and St. John Chrysostom, both tremendously gifted preachers and teachers. The liturgical calendar is becoming more consistent as well, and we have the beginnings of monasticism as we understand it now. This is a new way of martyrdom that is offered after the era of persecution ends. So before, as I was mentioning, you had this inspiring witness of the confessors and martyrs. What do you do when the church now is accepted and even becomes the official religion? And there's this tension going on of, where can people seek out something that is more demanding, more spiritually authentic even? And so here we have St. Anthony the Great and the Desert Fathers of Egypt, of Syria and Palestine, establishing this new way of life that became enormously important and is central to Orthodox spiritual life to this day. In the 5th century, we have St. Cyril of Alexandria as the most important theological figure, a powerful proponent of Orthodoxy who taught that Mary, the Virgin Mary, is the Theotokos, meaning the birth giver of God. Often would you say the mother of God, as opposed to the Nestorian heretics who insisted that the child in her womb was not actually the Son of God, not the same person as the Son of God. And it is in this period that we start to see much more focus on the figure of the Virgin Mary, precisely as a way to uphold this truth of our understanding of her Son, Jesus Christ, to affirm most emphatically that the person who is the Son of God is also exactly the same who is conceived in her womb and is born. In 431, the Third Ecumenical Council in Ephesus affirmed the teachings of St. Cyril. Then we come to, decades later, the Fourth Ecumenical Council in Chalcedon, and we have this time of real lasting crisis developing. This council in Chalcedon articulates that Christ is fully man and fully God, one person, and the Greek word here is hypostasis, in two natures, physis. One person in two natures, unconfused and undivided. So not confused in the sense of mixing them together, not divided. So that was like the Nestorian error, where you had effectively two persons under one name, Jesus Christ. So not confused, not divided. But we have a problem here. Although this is a very clear and simple way to express something that's an enormously complex reality, we have something expressed here that was difficult for many Christians of the time to accept because the terminology had changed. So in the course of these decades that we're talking about, in Greek, the word physis had shifted its meaning. So earlier, during the time that St. Cyril had been writing, it had a significance that was closer to what the Council of Chalcedon meant by hypostasis. So people were using physis to mean something more like a particular entity, a very specific entity, nature of humans, human nature, as opposed to a particular human. And so physis had been used by St. Cyril to speak of the instantiation, the particular being, Jesus Christ. And now, but it also had like kind of either meaning possible. You could talk using the same word in different contexts before, and you could have this sense of like a general existence and a very specific, particular existence. And now Chalcedon is trying to distinguish, to use a very precise word, hypostasis, to mean something that is exactly what is found in this precise entity, this precise person, the way we would say today in English, and saying physis now is just the general nature. Okay, but this was not accepted by people who were loyal to the language of St. Cyril of Alexandria, especially those who weren't native Greek speakers. They were Copts in Egypt, Syrians speaking Syriac in the Eastern Mediterranean. So they're not following the latest trends in Greek language. And so to their ears, this sounds like the doctrine that St. Cyril of Alexandria had so eloquently articulated was now being changed. To their ears, this sounded like something novel and false. And of course, to Greek speakers, it was the opposite. To their ears, to speak about one divine human physis, which is the way that the Miaphysites, often also called Monophysites. So to them, this sounds like you're saying something of this confused nature. Like it's not it's something new. It's a God-man nature, not like what was trying to be distinguished here, that you have one person, one hypostasis, with these two natures that are shared in the same person, but each of them their own thing. That the human nature is human, the divine nature is divine, not divided because they're united in one person, but they're distinctly two natures. And so each side was sure that they had the right way to articulate this, but they were basically talking past one another. So this led to a schism that would be the ongoing crisis that would be attempted to be resolved over these next couple of centuries. Meanwhile, in the West, so everything I've been saying about this crisis is primarily an issue in the East. In the West, there's a different dynamic. St. Augustine is the leading theologian of the era, a tremendously prolific writer, a gifted apologist, but not always very disciplined. He engaged in various rhetorical extremes that then were misapplied later. So, for example, he argued that Adam's free will became depraved because of his original sin, and thus he cannot participate in his own salvation unless God intervenes to make that possible. He also suggested that sin is inherent to marital relations, which would be the groundwork for the subsequent Western teaching that all clergy must be celibate. Rome is conquered in 476, which is the sign of an ongoing civic decline. It's also very much worth mentioning here that Augustine is not very familiar with Greek, and so what you have here is that he is providing this tremendous treasury of thought in Latin, and his own thought process is not tremendously up on what's going on among Greek thought, and so this is the beginning of a widening division between East and West, Greek speakers and Latin speakers, that they just are understanding one another, reading and learning from one another less and less over time. Coming to the 6th century, we have the tremendous influence of Emperor Justinian, who conducted a campaign of church building, establishing religious institutions, promoting iconography. He builds the first cathedral of Hagia Sophia. The famous one that we know now is a later, larger, and better built version of the same general concept that he had built in his time. And his capital, Constantinople, by this point is becoming the model of worship for the whole church. We now come to the 5th Ecumenical Council in 553, in the middle of the century, which is held in Constantinople. Tried again at this point to reconcile with Monophysites without success. At this council, the 5 ancient patriarchates are formally recognized. So Rome is first in honor, but recollect it's a ruin. So it's not in great shape, not in a position to have the kind of leadership as a practical matter that it had once had. So Constantinople is, you'll note, inserted in second place. It's not anywhere near as ancient as the rest of these being mentioned. It's being put in here because it's the capital of the empire. It's the center of the world from their perspective, and so that is practically speaking where leadership resides among these 5 and in the church in general. But anyway, Rome first, Constantinople second, and then you have Alexandria, which had been in previous centuries the intellectual center, but now is definitely fading in influence. Antioch, and last of all Jerusalem, which is primarily just because of the history of Jerusalem, not because it's itself at this point very dynamic as a force on the world stage. In the 7th century, we have 2 heretical ideas that are proposed: monenergism and monothelitism. So this is respectively monenergism, one activity, monothelitism, one will of Jesus Christ. Okay, so this is basically 2 different ways of people are trying to split the baby here. They're trying to say, well, okay, we're agreeing with Chalcedon that Jesus is both God and man, one hypostasis, 2 natures, but we're trying to reach out to those who didn't agree with that formula. So how about we say, okay, all that, but he has only the divine will, only the divine activity. But as you can, I think, recognize immediately, this is effectively denying that Christ has a human activity and will. That's basically what it means. And that's a huge problem because why did the Son of God take flesh in the first place, if not to heal and restore and put into full effect a perfected human activity and will, to address the wounded, sinful, fallen activity and will that caused the problem in the first place? I mean, what else except activity and will led to the fall in the first place? And so if Christ doesn't have these, then our whole understanding of salvation is called into question. What has been saved if we're speaking of Christ not having a human activity and will? Unfortunately, these false ideas are embraced and promoted by Pope Honorius of Rome, as he is trying to promote reconciliation in the East. These heresies are courageously opposed by St. Maximus the Confessor. He's called the Confessor because he's horribly tortured for publicly teaching against these ideas. The Sixth Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in 681 condemns both of these heresies. The 7th century sees the rise of Islam. So we have Muhammad, a figure who lives in the Arabian Peninsula. He dies in 632. By 644, his Muslim successors reign from Persia to Egypt, and they carry this new religion of Islam that Muhammad established all across North Africa, and North African Christianity outside of Egypt and Sudan basically completely disappears. It's shocking to see how it collapses. By 714, so less than a century after Muhammad, Muslims invade Spain and conquer most of it. In the 8th century, we see iconoclasm introduced with Emperor Leo III. He was a gifted administrator and commander, and he was trying to reform and strengthen the empire, and in his mind, icons were kind of a decadent thing that wasn't authentic Christianity to his mind. He had a crude understanding of this all, one that frankly we hear a whole lot. I hear this all the time from Protestants citing the Old Testament prohibition against graven images, coming from the Ten Commandments and so on, which misses important understandings. First of all, that we could find numerous examples commanded by God himself to carve images. There are times when it actually is necessary to be obedient to God to do this, notably the cherubim that surround the Ark of the Covenant, but also missing the fact of the incarnation, that there's something that has changed in God's revelation of himself. Before he was the utterly invisible God, but now he has revealed himself to us. So this is exactly what St. John of Damascus taught during this time. The immaterial God in former times must not be depicted, but God has embraced matter in the incarnation, and so matter is appropriate to venerate icons which depict God incarnate. He now has a human face. We can depict that face. That's a good thing to do, in fact. So, continuing in the 8th century, we have councils ecumenical and not. In the not category, 754, we have the Iconoclastic Council, which fell into dualist confusion. So it was emphasizing far too much the distinction and basically creating a division of the natures of Christ, not understanding that icons depict the human nature of Christ, and then in that visible form reveal the invisible. They were insisting that icons were depicting the immaterial God directly, which is just not a correct understanding at all. So 787, the 7th Ecumenical Council in Nicaea, affirms the value and necessity of icons in our worship. It teaches that icons leave the divine invisible, but unite the invisible divine with the visible human nature in the same person. So you are in the icon seeing Jesus Christ depicted in his human form, that human form that the apostles would have seen. And they could not see the hidden divine nature any more than it's revealed in the icons. But it is there. It is there present inseparably within the same person. We're seeing things that are visible in the icons, and that is opening us up to an understanding and a participation in that which is invisible, that is beyond our sight. It also taught, the Seventh Ecumenical Council taught, that the honor paid to the image passes to the prototype. This is citing an older teaching of St. Basil the Great. So the prototype here is Christ God, whom we worship. So we are not worshiping the icon itself, but in reverencing the image, the honor passes to what is depicted, Christ himself. In the 9th century, we see the triumph of Orthodoxy. So persecution returns even after the Seventh Ecumenical Council, but at last, with the death of the final iconoclast emperor, the schism ends in 843. And with great ceremony, the icons are restored in Constantinople at the beginning of Lent, the Sunday of Orthodoxy, a commemoration that we keep today in our church. So it's like as we come to Lent, we will see that the first Sunday is this commemoration of this bringing icons, the restoration of icons to the churches. And that's where we especially uphold this truth of the centrality of icons to our worship. In other developments in the 9th century, we see Charlemagne and his successors were bringing renewed strength to the West, fighting Muslims, and generally just establishing a new power base in France and Germany. It was called Francia. The Latin West spiritually is united under the Pope, and we see Charlemagne and his successors increasingly undermining the East as a poorly understood holdover of the past, while Charlemagne is crowned Holy Roman Emperor, which is something that is quite offensive in the East, where there's already a Roman emperor. He's ruling in Constantinople, but Charlemagne says, I don't care about you, I'm ruling from my capital in the West. This same period sees St. Cyril and Methodius, evangelizers of the Slavs, at work toward the end of the century. And they are very important witnesses working to establish a new written language for the Slavic peoples so that they can come to know the Christian faith, to be able to read and hear the gospel and the worship of the church in their own language. And this is a very important Orthodox principle. One last point. This is something that has largely been forgotten, but is worth quickly spending some time on, the Photian controversy. So St. Photius was Patriarch of Constantinople. He was attacked by Pope Nicholas I, who tried to force the restoration of Patriarch Ignatius. So he was the prior Patriarch of Constantinople, and Ignatius was a godly man, unjustly deposed, but Photius was not involved in any of that dispute, and he had been legitimately elected to bring peace after the deposition of Patriarch Ignatius. Pope Nicholas was stepping in, asserting his papal authority. He was trying to present himself as having a universal jurisdiction, that he could intervene and decree what needed to happen in Constantinople, another one of the 5 patriarchates, let's recall. So he accused Photius of all sorts of so-called heresies, which were just normal ancient Eastern practices, having a married clergy, clergy wearing beards, using leavened bread in the Eucharist. Photius is deposed due to imperial politics. After Ignatius dies, so Ignatius returns to lead Constantinople for a time, but he's elderly and poor health. When he dies, Photius is restored once again. So you have this back and forth going on in the Church of Constantinople. In 879, there is a council led by St. Photius in Constantinople to resolve this schism that had arisen between Rome and the East. This council, Rome, is reaffirmed as first in honor, but explicitly without jurisdiction in the East. The council also rejected the filioque, that phrase that had been introduced at this point, was in circulation in the West, asserting that the Holy Spirit proceeds not just from the Father, his true origin, but adds this extra phrase, the filioque, and from the Son, a false teaching. So this council in 879 rejects the filioque and any other modification to the creed, the symbol of faith. It's already good. It covers everything that needs to be said. For 2 centuries after 879, Rome, the Church of Rome, recognized this council, the Photian Council of Constantinople, as the 8th Ecumenical Council. Just think on that for a moment. Think of this. But for 2 centuries, this was recognized east and west as an important source of teaching for the church. And if you think about what's affirmed here, these are very good and healthy principles that had been established at this council. Oddly, it's very strange, but this council has been largely forgotten now, and much of that due to a deliberate campaign in the West. So after 200 years, there was a flip, and a previous council, which was condemned at this council of 879, that one was declared the 8th Ecumenical Council in Rome, and Photius was considered a schismatic bishop all the way until the last 50 years. So it's only been recently that East and West there's been a correction of this false history that had been promoted. Moving on to the 10th century, we see a period of cultural flourishing in the East, but the West is struggling. So in the West, we see Cluniac reforms that eventually were instituted to revitalize the Western Church, but the problem is that these reforms are contrary to Orthodox understanding when they come to be introduced in the 11th century, and this is going to increase divisions East and West. The rite of marriage is introduced into church practice in the East. This rite of marriage was something that the church was called upon to create and put into practice as part of a reform of the laws that were separating civil and church law, so that there would be a distinct arena of church authority over things like marriages, and other areas that would be a different arena of civil law. The 10th century is also important for the baptism of Rus, Kievan Rus, a power center for Grand Prince Vladimir, so not yet called Russia or Ukraine either, like neither of those terms were in use at the time, but Rus was the term used. So Vladimir had been a pagan lord of the Slavs, and he and his advisors came to decide that they needed to become Orthodox Christians. In reaching out to Constantinople, they came to a negotiated arrangement, and Vladimir received the baptismal name Basil, and his people were baptized en masse. In the 11th century, Pope Sergius writes a confession of faith that includes the filioque, so this is a big deal. For 200 years previous, there had been a firm conviction, fairly consistent conviction among popes and church leadership in general that the filioque was not appropriate, but now in 1014 it is formally introduced into the Roman liturgy. So this is obviously a serious breach with Orthodox doctrine. The biggest problem, however, is the insistence on the universal jurisdiction of Rome, that the Pope has authority over the churches everywhere throughout the world. 1054, we come to the Great Schism, which is what's being depicted in the image here on the slide. It's this dispute that is an example of this assertion of universal jurisdiction of the Pope. It's more of a diplomatic dispute. It's not like there's literally like a spiritual war declared or something like that. But it does come to be symbolic, and it's a good marker to show, okay, before this point things are strained, but fundamentally East and West are united. After this point, they are much more disunited. and coming to a point of absolute schism. In 1095, we see the First Crusade, which is sent in response to a call for aid by the Byzantine emperor. So obviously that does indicate that there's still great sympathy, like a Christian sympathy, understanding one as brethren in this response. In the 12th century, in the West, we see scholasticism coming to dominate Western thought. This is a mode of thought that's very philosophical. I'm using this deductive reasoning that you start from like these first assumptions that are not, I should really underline here, they are not the same assumptions that the church had traditionally held. They're kind of an abstract way of thinking of things that then kind of imposes this systemic understanding on all of church teaching, in the process really diverging from the patristic norms that the Orthodox Church in the East was continuing to hold. But this becomes just the way that everyone who's doing theological reflection in the West, they're part of this scholastic movement. In 1147, we see the Second Crusade, which is declared to reclaim the Crusader kingdom of Edessa. In the course of this effort, there are some very serious diplomatic breaches between the Byzantines and the Latins, serious mutual distrust, and this is helping to firm up that division, East and West. So in the 13th century, we see the schism solidified. The Fourth Crusade descends into the conquest of Constantinople. That's what's being depicted here on the slide. A horrible pillage. The city is sacked at the beginning of the century, and most of the empire is divided up into these little petty kingdoms. So it's a real terrible violence to Christian brotherhood. In 1274, the Council of Lyon attempts reconciliation. The Byzantine emperor, trying to regain full control of his empire, pressures Greek delegates to this council to agree to Roman primacy, that universal jurisdiction that we've been talking about, and the filioque. So both of these sticking points that are very unorthodox. The emperor's like, I don't care, I just want to sort things out with the Latins. But this Council of Lyon is rejected after this emperor dies, and his picked patriarch is deposed. So this attempt fails. In the 13th century, looking at Serbia, Bulgaria, and Rus. In Serbia, we see the church in Serbia has been growing in strength, and in 1220, it is recognized as autonomous. The Bulgarian Patriarchate in the century is also restored. It had flourished under Constantinople earlier, but for a long period, it had been conquered and fallen to pagans, and there really hadn't been any opportunity for Christian worship. In 1240, Kiev and Rus falls to the Mongols. So Novgorod, a city to the north, under Alexander Nevsky, becomes the protector of Russian peoples. So he is a careful diplomat with the Mongols, ensuring that there's survival, that they're not crushed the way that Kiev had been. But he engages in successful military campaigns against the Swedes and the Teutonic Knights. So he's judicious about where to concede and make various diplomatic arrangements and where to fight. The Metropolitan of Kiev remains the spiritual leader of the region throughout the period, regardless. In the 14th century, we come to St. Gregory Palamas of Mount Athos, who establishes that we can come into direct contact with God through pure prayer. So not participating in his divine nature, but rather to have a real connection through God's activity in the world. That is God's activity in the world is not something separate from God, but is a tangible connection to God. During the 14th century, we also see St. Sergius of Radonej, the father of Russian monasticism, and Serbia and Bulgaria, tragically, are conquered by the Turks and remain under their control until the 20th century. The 15th century, the Council of Florence. So this is another attempt to reconcile East and West. It's the last significant effort. The Greek delegates, under great pressure, agreed to a very strong reading of papal supremacy, the filioque, also conceded on uniformity with Western practice. So basically anything meaningful that was a distinct Eastern practice was to be abandoned. Demands from Rome and the West are getting harsher and harsher as we go on. Everyone who participates signs except for Bishop Mark of Ephesus, and this is why he is known as the pillar of Orthodoxy. The Orthodox Christians at large, just the people, do not accept the Council of Florence, and so even though all these bishops had signed on, most of them end up recanting afterwards, saying this was a bad idea, foolish effort, and so the witness of St. Mark of Ephesus prevails. Without any Latin aid, Latin aid was conditional on agreeing to the Council of Florence. So when that falls through, Constantinople receives no support, no defense, under great threat from the Ottomans. In 1453, at last Constantinople falls in a horrific assault. By the end of the century, the Romanian kingdoms are reduced to vassal states as well, and Christians throughout the whole area in the East are made into subject peoples under the immediate authority of their bishops, who themselves are answerable to Muslim rulers. In 1479, Moscow conquers Novgorod and becomes the premier Russian power from then on. In the 16th century, we see in 1593, Moscow is accepted as a patriarchate by Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Antioch. It will not be recognized by Constantinople until much later. The union of two different kingdoms under one ruler, so the union of Poland and Lithuania, leads to the union of church leadership under the standard set by the Council of Florence. So remember that that had been this arrangement where, sure, we'll recognize that you're Christians, we will accept you as long as you come under Rome in basically every way that matters. And so this is what's imposed on Poland and Lithuania. The Protestant Reformation, meanwhile, is beginning in 1521 under Martin Luther. So he's responding to excesses in the Latin West, and that becomes a dominant feature for the next few centuries of this great division between Protestants and Catholics. Unfortunately for the history of the Church, as we're coming to understand, this is a spiritual low point, this whole era. The Orthodox Church is very weak. It does not have any great witnesses to respond to these developments. Orthodox leaders, in engaging with the Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, don't really offer any creative ideas during this time. Basically, they give Catholic answers to argue with Protestants, and Protestant answers to argue with Catholics. There's not like an authentic Orthodox vision of how really to engage these questions, and whether the questions are even the right questions to ask in the first place. Yes, the 17th century as a spiritual low point. We see the Niconian reforms in Russia. It's well-intentioned, trying to bring greater order, leads to a lasting schism with old believers in Russia, traditionalists and these were the people who were the most devout. They are the ones who reject most strongly these reforms and leave the church, and as a schismatic group for the next few centuries are doing their own thing, and this is a lasting harm to the spiritual health of the Church of Russia. Outside of Russia, the church is in captivity. Russia is independent to a lesser degree. Romania, they're effectively vassal states that are having to bow to all sorts of pressures from the Muslims. But the rest of the church in the East is entirely under Muslim authority and suffers in consequence. In the 18th century, we see a spiritual revival that is first taking place in Greek culture. So the Kalivalius fathers, these are refugees from Mount Athos. That's a story all to its own. We don't have time to get into it. But they are these brilliant readers and writers. They are collecting what had largely been a forgotten body of of spiritual writings and teachings, especially ascetical teachings, basically looking at the whole monastic tradition from the 4th century through the 15th century, and doing this massive publication work to share it with the world, the Philokalia, that is a gift to the church to this day. They also advocated for regular participation in communion, not just doing it a few times a year. So, unfortunately, this same period, while you're seeing this great revival in Greece and that general area, that same time is a very difficult period for Russia. It's a period of Western captivity, not in the sense that necessarily, I mean, parts of them were under Western rulers, as we're talking about Poland and Lithuania, that's still power during this time period. But in any case, we see Peter the Great, who is this dynamic ruler, reestablishing Russian power, fighting back against depredations from Western powers. But at the same time, he's taking in a lot of Western ideas and imposing them artificially in Russia. And he forces the Church of Russia to become an instrument of his rule. The Patriarchate is abolished, and the Synod of Bishops is utterly humiliated. It is governed by a civil minister. Dioceses are also administered by civil authorities. So bishops are still there, but they are subordinates to civil authorities. And regular clergy are made into the equivalent of civil servants. This does tremendous damage to their legitimacy, their spiritual authority. However, even during this very difficult period, there are good things happening. Notably, in 1794, the mission to Alaska. The priest Juvenali becomes the first martyr in Kenai, Alaska. St. Herman, the last of that small mission to the Alaskan peoples, establishes a little hermitage on Kodiak Island and establishes a lasting Orthodox witness in the New World. Then in the 19th century, we see a Russian revival. There's a spiritual revival that flourishes with the translation of the Philokalia. The elders of Optina are the heart of all this. Also, St. Seraphim of Sarov, an incredibly influential figure. Not just in Russia, but actually he was someone that became known across the world. There are just remarkable accounts of people learning about him from like London and places like that. In the late 19th century, there's tremendous intellectual energy, flourishing in theology and literature, really creative ideas at work. Also in the 19th century, we have the inspiring witness of St. Innocent of Alaska, who does heroic labor and brilliant labor as well. He's doing great work of translation and writing to establish a strong Diocese of Alaska. He is later chosen to be Metropolitan of Moscow. And then at the end of the century, we see St. John the Wonder Worker of Kronstadt, another incredibly powerful spiritual figure. In the 19th century, we see the spread of Orthodoxy in America. So St. Innocent had established a flourishing diocese in Alaska, as I said, but then during the 19th century, Alaska is transferred from the Russian Empire to the United States of America. There were people who were worried about this, but Metropolitan Innocent wrote about it, saying that he celebrated this as the opening of a new mission field, because now Alaska, being introduced to the United States of America, can be a springboard to spread the witness of Orthodoxy throughout North America. Over the course of the century, immigrants from Orthodox homelands come to North America, establishing communities, and we have amongst them the figure of Saint Alexis Toth. So we have the Uniates. So remember what I was talking about before with that union of Poland and Lithuania, that it also created this union of churches that were, it was not an equal or fair union. It was just simply forcing Orthodox Christians to come under Roman authority, and so it's called the Unia. So we have Uniates, who are those who had been brought up to worship under this strange arrangement. And many of them are coming from places in Eastern Europe to America, and a large number of them, under the leadership of St. Alexis Toth, realize that they don't have to hold with this old false idea that the Orthodox Church is right there as their neighbors, and they actually come and join the Orthodox Church, leaving behind this Uniate practice. Elsewhere in the world, we see the rise of national churches as the Ottoman Empire weakens, and you have various revolutions and wars of independence. The beginnings of the 20th century, before the Russian Revolution. So in 1898, just as the century is turning, Saint Tikhon becomes bishop of the Mission Diocese of Alaska. So it's still known by its connection with its mother, Alaska, but the see, his cathedral had already been moved to San Francisco, despite being called the Diocese of Alaska. In 1904, he moves his see to New York. In 1907, he convenes the first All-American Sobor. This is the Russian term that we now call these All-American Councils. We're continuing that same tradition that he established. So bringing together leadership from across America to deliberate on the direction of the church in America. So the first All-American Sobor has the theme, the question that they're addressing is how to spread the mission. And what St. Tikhon articulates is a vision of this archdiocese becoming a self-governing church. So not simply being an extension of the Church of Russia, but he has already, in 1907, a vision that it ought to be a church for this local people, for those who are living and building a home here in America, using the American civil calendar, caring for Orthodox of all backgrounds, eventually using English in worship and teaching. These principles are basically the marching orders that the Orthodox Church in America continues to apply to this day. That vision that he laid out was something that is still good and worthy for us today. During the same time, St. Raphael is consecrated a bishop in 1904 for the pastoral care of the Arab community. So precisely in that vision that St. Tikhon has. Not just for, it's like an extension of the Russian Empire, being a church for Russians here in North America, but wanting to care for the Arab community. They'd begun a similar effort for the Serbs, tried to do one for the Greeks, but no one responded, so they weren't able to do much pastoral care. The Greek parishes were being established without a bishop, so in a rather uncanonical way, they're just establishing ones and writing home, send us a priest. There was no regard for the existing diocese in America from the Greek parishes. They just were doing their own thing. Then, 1917, we see the Russian Revolution. So this is not the time to go into the detail of all that, but just essentially to say very briefly that this led to the end of the Russian Empire, the coming eventually to power of the Bolsheviks, of the Soviet Union, and the church is oppressed. In 1920, Patriarch Tikhon, so the same St. Tikhon who had been bishop in New York, by this point has been elected Patriarch of Moscow. And in 1920, he decreed that all dioceses cut off from Russia should govern themselves under local supervision until circumstances change. In 1924, another All-American Sobor declared the Metropolia. So this is the term that is used for this separated archdiocese in America. It's now declared to be self-governing with a continuing spiritual bond to Russia, but under this directive from Patriarch Tikhon, they would have to be self-governing until they could be reconciled properly. So, meanwhile, there's what is called a synod in exile established in Europe. So these are bishops that fled their diocese in the Russian Empire, and with other refugees were living in Europe in the West. They convened this synod in exile, claiming jurisdiction throughout the world. And when the Metropolia rejected their claim, they were suspended by the synod. This whole model for church governance is not one that has ever been seen previously in the history of the church. So it was a very unusual, questionable arrangement. and one that the metropolia, which, they were already established. They had their own good order previously, and they did not recognize the synod in exile as having authority over them. And so there's this mutual division going on here. Meanwhile, the Soviets introduced something called the living church, this kind of a front operation that the predecessors of the KGB set up using their agents and operatives. They find some priests that are willing to cooperate, make them bishops. These bishops then pseudo-ordain fake priests to go out and claim churches around the world in the name of this living church that's, again, just a front group for the Soviet Union. They successfully seize various churches, famously the St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York City. That had been the cathedral that St. Tikhon had set up. They attempt to seize our own parish of Saints Peter and Paul, but the case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sides with us. And so that sets a new precedent, and from then on, basically the living church is abandoned when this precedent is established, and churches in America are no longer under the threat of seizure. Instead, in 1934, the Church of Russia declared the Metropolia in America illegal. But again, the Metropolia was not recognizing the authority of the Church of Russia, which was having to, all its public actions are largely dictated by Soviet authorities, so not to be trusted. So looking at the Orthodox Church in America in the 20th century, in 1938, St. Vladimir's Seminary is established as a school of theology, St. Tikhon's as a pastoral school. These are, to this day, dynamic seminaries that serve the needs of the Orthodox Church in America and beyond. In 1970, a Tomos of Autocephaly is issued. This is a formal document by the Church of Russia, which recognizes the Orthodox Church in America. So the Metropolia is now fully recognized by the Church of Russia. The Orthodox Church in America is now understood to be autocephalous, having its own head. That's what that means. So we've got our own spiritual head. We're not dependent on the Church of Russia for the Holy Mysteries, for the election of a metropolitan or any of our bishops. We don't follow the directions of the Synod of Bishops in Russia. But there is an ongoing spiritual bond that is recognized. So the Church of Russia is understood to be the spiritual mother of the Orthodox Church in America. That same year, St. Herman of Alaska is canonized, the first saint to be canonized in America. Skipping lightly ahead to our own times, the 21st century, and seeing current tensions. And what we see is that the churches of Russia and Constantinople have broken communion. Constantinople has been claiming increasing authority in the world, something that is really of questionable legitimacy, but basically suggesting that it has some degree of jurisdiction in all sorts of areas that are encroaching on the authority of other Orthodox churches. Most significantly, they recognized the breakaway National Ukrainian Church, which had ordained its own bishops uncanonically and thus was not understood to be a legitimate church. But now this is the one that Constantinople recognizes in Ukraine by Constantinople, not by others, including the OCA. So there are many Orthodox churches which do not recognize this. Meanwhile, tragically, the Church of Russia has fallen under the control of the Putin regime, and it's not quite as bad a condition as it was under the Soviet Union, but by no means is the Church of Russia these days acting independently and with real spiritual authority. There are many decisions and statements being made by the Church of Russia which are not authentic, simply not authentic to the Orthodox tradition, especially when it pertains to the war in Ukraine. Other churches are trying to mediate, notably, again, the Orthodox Church in America, which has pretty good relations with both the Church of Russia and Constantinople. And that now concludes our presentation tonight. So thank you for your attention, and would welcome your questions and comments on everything that we've covered today. God bless you all, and talk to you soon.